Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a rocky Mediterranean island, where the winds smell faintly of sea salt, goat hair, and political tension. You're standing on a sun-baked hillside in Corsica, brushing dust off your sandals, and squinting down at a modest stone house where a baby is wailing his way into history. It's 1769. Ayacho. And the infant in question, who's currently busy kicking his blanket into a dramatic knot, will one day become Emperor of the French. But right now, he's just little Napoleon Bonaparte, child number 2 in a big, mildly chaotic Corsican family. And yes, his name does have that many vowels. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly down the hillside. The air is warm, and cicadas are buzzing like sleepy violinists. Corsica has just been taken over by France, literally months before Napoleon is born. The islanders aren't thrilled. Napoleon's own dad, Carlo, had actually supported the resistance before he decided that, well, maybe France wasn't that bad if you wanted free tuition for your kids. Carlo shifts gears from freedom fighter to minor French bureaucrat faster than a politician dodging a microphone. Thanks to this switcheroo, baby Napoleon gets a foot in the French education system, but the locals never forget. For most of his childhood, Napoleon is seen as both too Corsican for France and too French for Corsica. An identity crisis in a tricorn hat.by age 9, he's being sent off to the mainland to attend a Royal Military Academy. Picture a scrawny, Italian-accented boy trying to survive in a school full of snooty aristocrats who spend more time perfecting their fencing poses than learning algebra. Napoleon brings none of the usual polish. No money, no title, and crucially, no fluency in French. At first, he can barely speak the language, and when he does, he speaks it wrong. The other boys tease him mercilessly. He's mocked for his awkward grammar, his accent, even his lunch. His sandwiches smell weird, probably because they include pickled sardines or olive paste or something equally Mediterranean. He copes the way any future conqueror might, by sulking, plotting, and reading military history under the covers. That's where you'd find him most nights, hunched in bed, lantern flickering, muttering about Julius Caesar while the other kids dream about court balls and powdered wigs. Napoleon doesn't dream of society life. He dreams of artillery formations. Historians still argue whether young Napoleon was genuinely shy or just quietly storing up his enemies' names for later. What's clear is that even as a child, he's already obsessed with power, precision, and proving everyone wrong. When he finally gets promoted to a military school at Brienne, he sharpens those instincts further. His grades in math and artillery strategy? Excellent. His grades in dancing, small talk, and not holding grudges? Room for improvement. By the time he's 16, he's a freshly minted lieutenant, still short, still sulky, and still nursing a lifelong grudge against people who use whom correctly. But he's armed with ambition, equations, and a deep belief that the world doesn't yet recognize his genius. Which, to be fair, is technically true. And so, he sets off toward his first real army post, unaware that his career will soon hinge on a single artillery decision, a city called Toulon, and the most chaotic job promotion in military history. Section 2. You rub the sleep from your eyes, lace up your boots, again, and find yourself trudging through slushy mud on the edge of a foggy French garrison town. The year is 1785, and the drumbeat of the military academy echoes like a metronome for the perpetually disciplined. Somewhere among the freezing cadets, hunched against the wind, is young Lieutenant Napoleon Bonaparte. His boots are too tight. His coat is slightly too long. And his sense of self-importance? Already several inches taller than he is, you spot him in the corner of the barracks, furiously scribbling into a notebook with the intensity of someone plotting something mildly dramatic, possibly a war. Possibly just how to outscore that annoying blonde kid in geometry. Either way, he's immersed. You could set off a cannon next to him, and he'd barely blink. Which, incidentally, is the exact sort of focus that will define his early career. Napoleon is stationed in Valence, a town not particularly known for grandeur, but blessed with taverns, boredom, and just enough artillery to keep him interested. He doesn't exactly make friends. In fact, he mostly terrifies people with his endless lectures on Roman warfare and cannon calibration. He writes constantly, essays, short novels, political rants, you name it. Some of his fiction includes tales of noble Corsicans who are clearly, and not at all subtly, just him with a fake mustache. He also devours Enlightenment literature, Rousseau, Voltaire, Plutarch, though oddly, he seems to interpret freedom and equality as sure, but I'll be in charge. His free time is spent in libraries or walking alone, muttering about destiny. Occasionally, he writes home to his family, peppering his letters with complaints about the army's food, the idiocy of his fellow officers, and his complete certainty that France is about to collapse, and that someone smart and short should probably step in. Historians still argue whether his sense of impending French disaster was foresight or just good guesswork. Either way, he's not wrong. France in the late 1780s is basically a souffle of economic collapse, royal debt, and angry bakers. The revolution is simmering, and Napoleon is watching it unfold with the intensity of a man already designing new flags. Then, in 1789, the revolution finally breaks the surface like a crusty baguette exploding in a poorly sealed oven. France becomes a political chaos machine, guillotines are back in style, and everyone is either fleeing the country or reinventing it on parchment. Napoleon, now in his early 20s, seizes this moment not with panic, but with paperwork. He writes political essays in support of the new republic, denounces the monarchy with a passion usually reserved for sports fans, and positions himself as both a patriot and a professional cannon nerd. Around this time, he returns briefly to Corsica, hoping to play a role in shaping its future. But home is no longer home. The Bonaparte family is torn between royalists and revolutionaries. Napoleon sides with the latter, and it doesn't end well. He gets into a political scuffle with the local resistance leader, who is also his former hero, accidentally starts a small civil war, and is eventually declared a traitor by his own island. So, he flees back to France, homeless, broke, and now technically a political exile from Corsica. But still with that unnerving confidence in his own future. He brings his siblings along, naturally, because nothing says future world leader like couch surfing with 4 relatives and exactly 1 uniform. For a while, he's jobless, restless, and stuck in limbo. He writes more, including an unfinished romantic novel where the main character is definitely just him again, but with better hair. Then, in 1793, fate finally takes pity. The French Republic is trying to hold on to the city of Toulon, where royalists and British forces have teamed up for a dramatic standoff. The army needs someone to coordinate the artillery. Most officers politely decline. Napoleon, of course, does not. He sees it not just as a battlefield, but as an audition. And in the salt-swept cliffs outside Toulon, with cannons in place and enemies lined up like bowling pins, Napoleon prepares to turn his first real command into a literal blast. Section 3. You wake up on the side of a rocky hill, boots soaked in dew, the taste of gunpowder hanging faintly in the morning air. Below you, the port city of Toulon glimmers in early sunlight, bristling with sails, cannons, and the general tension of a city that knows it's about to be shelled. You stretch, glance sideways, and there he is, Lieutenant Napoleon Bonaparte, tugging at his gloves and barking instructions at a terrified crew of artillerymen. He's only 24, barely out of cadethood, and yet somehow commanding a battalion like he's been doing this since birth. There's no official rank that grants him this power, just his unrelenting confidence, his obsessively detailed plans, and the fact that nobody else wants to figure out how to aim 40 cannons through a hillside fog. The Siege of Toulon. December 1793. Royalist rebels inside the city have invited British and Spanish troops to help them hold the port. The French Republic, recently short on victories and high on revolutionary paranoia, cannot afford to lose this one. But their forces are scattered, confused, and short on leaders.so when a pushy Corsican officer shows up with a plan to take back the harbor using precise artillery strikes. Someone finally shrugs and says, "Fine. Let the short one try." Napoleon sets to work like a man arranging his childhood toy soldiers, except this time, they're real people, and the stakes are, well, existence. He studies the terrain, calculates angles, and identifies the exact spot from which to strike the enemy's supply lines. The location? A little hill called La Grande Battery. The move? Bold. The result? Explosions, followed by chaos, followed by victory. One well-timed bombardment forces the British fleet to abandon the port. The Royalists flee. Toulon is retaken, and just like that, Napoleon goes from that weird artillery lieutenant with too many opinions to the guy who just saved an entire war effort. Historians still argue whether his success at Toulon was military genius or just lucky geometry. But either way, the results are hard to ignore. The French government promotes him to brigadier general, virtually overnight. His name begins to circulate in political salons and military headquarters. There are whispers. That Corsican. That kid. The one who knows how to win. Napoleon soaks it in, but not with glee, more like grim validation. This was inevitable, he believes. He's not arrogant, exactly. He just has a firm belief that the universe is finally catching up to his plans. He starts writing more letters to his brother, to Josephine, who he hasn't met yet, but destiny is warming up backstage, and even some revolutionary figures. Positioning himself as not just a soldier, but a thinker, a statesman, maybe something more. The truth is, Napoleon wants power, but he also wants narrative. He wants to be remembered. Back in Paris, the government is unraveling. The reign of terror is winding down, but nobody knows what's next. Factions rise and fall faster than soufflés. Amid the mess, Napoleon takes a post in the Army of the Interior. It's an odd job, part security detail, part errand boy, but it puts him in the capital, close to power. More importantly, it's where he meets Josephine de Beauharnais, a stylish widow with aristocratic connections, 2 kids, and a smile that could convince a cat to pay rent. Josephine isn't immediately impressed. Napoleon, in his letters, is romantic to the point of desperation. But he's persistent, intense, full of fire. And probably the only man in Paris who doesn't care that she's a little older. He proposes. She hesitates. He insists. She says yes. Meanwhile, France assigns him to lead a campaign in Italy. It's not a glamorous assignment. The army of Italy is underfed, underpaid, and undermotivated. But Napoleon shows up, surveys the mess, and starts rewriting the playbook. He drills his troops, rations supplies, and makes speeches that could convince soggy laundry to rise up and charge the Alps. His soldiers start calling him the Little Corporal, a nickname born partly from affection, partly from the fact that he's not exactly towering. And so, with barely time to unpack his wedding gifts, Napoleon heads off to Italy, eager to prove that Toulon wasn't a fluke, and that France's future might just be measured in cannon range and charisma. Section 4. The smell of roses and gunpowder lingers in the spring air as you step into a narrow Parisian corridor. Candlelight flickers on velvet drapes, and somewhere, Josephine is adjusting the tilt of her headpiece just so, unaware that she's marrying not just a general, but a man who will later write her love letters in between artillery assaults. It's March 1796. The French Revolution is still cooling, like an oven that almost exploded. Napoleon Bonaparte, now all of 26 years old, marries the dazzling, debt-laden Josephine de Beauharnais in what is arguably one of the messiest, yet most consequential matches in European history. She's graceful, worldly, and 8 years older. He's intense, awkward, and already mentally drafting military orders during the ceremony. Their wedding lasts about as long as a strong breeze. Within 2 days, Napoleon is off, not on a honeymoon, but to lead the army of Italy, which has been described, generously, as a damp, starving collection of muskets and complaints. You arrive with him at the Alpine foothills, where soldiers are shivering in tents patched together with old uniforms and revolutionary slogans. They're underfed, unpaid, and underwhelmed. Until Napoleon climbs a rock and makes a speech. Now, here's the thing. Napoleon is not a tall man, but he talks tall, and his speeches aren't flowery, they're electric. He tells his troops they will eat well, march fast, and live forever in the history books. They cheer, probably confused, definitely hungry, but undeniably fired up. Within weeks, Napoleon begins what is now called the First Italian Campaign. The goal? Dislodge Austrian forces and spread revolutionary vibes. The strategy? Move fast, hit hard, and confuse everyone, including your own supply line that he divides his army, attacks from strange angles, and outmaneuvers larger, better-funded forces using speed, deception, and an almost absurd level of confidence. Victories come quickly. Montagnat, Lodi, Arcole. Each one further solidifies his reputation. At the Battle of Lodi, he personally leads a charge across a narrow bridge while cannonballs whistle past his ears like overexcited pigeons. His men follow him not because they have to, but because they believe he might actually pull it off. Historians still debate whether Lodi was a decisive battle or just really good PR. But Napoleon himself later said it was there he realized he was different, that he was meant for something greater, that he was, well, Napoleon. Back in Paris, newspapers begin printing breathless dispatches of his victories. He sends letters home, many of which are equal parts romantic and bureaucratic. I crushed the Austrians today, miss your perfume. That sort of thing that as he pushes deeper into Italy, Napoleon starts to behave less like a general and more like a minor emperor. He negotiates treaties, rearranges borders, and writes constitutions for puppet republics faster than most people write grocery lists. He demands art, horses, and money be sent back to France. The Louvre starts to fill with looted statues and stolen paintings, all conveniently liberated in the name of the Republic. And through all this, he keeps writing to Josephine, sometimes daily, passionate, poetic, slightly unhinged letters that read like someone took Shakespeare and dipped him in espresso. She, meanwhile, is reportedly hosting salons in Paris, buying dresses, and occasionally forgetting to write back. That Napoleon's letters grow more frantic. I am sick with love, he writes. Your letters are cold as if you love me less. In modern terms, he's double texting and not getting replies. Painful stuff, but military success distracts him. In 1797, he forces Austria to the negotiating table and signs the Treaty of Campo Formio, effectively ending the war and redrawing the map of Europe with a fountain pen he probably insisted on picking himself. He returns to Paris a hero. The people cheer, the politicians panic, and Josephine, well, she finally remembers to greet him. And yet, even as bouquets rain down and medals jingle, Napoleon is already restless. Italy was a warm-up. He's thinking bigger now. Much bigger. The pyramids are calling. But first, a brief detour into science, sphinxes, and a few surprising camels. Section 5. The sails creak above you as the sea breeze carries a scent of salt, citrus, and just the faintest whiff of ambition. You lean on the railing of a crowded French warship, squinting toward the hazy outline of Alexandria. Beside you, an officer mutters about sand in his boots. Behind you, an oddly intense man in a bicorn hat is staring at the horizon like it's personal. It's 1798. Napoleon Bonaparte, fresh from conquering Italy and writing overwrought love letters, has decided that France should probably own Egypt next. Why? Well, reasons. Strategic ones, mostly. Cut off British trade with India. Expand French influence. Build a canal, maybe. Also, pyramids are cool, and so he set sail not just with 40,000 soldiers, but also with 167 scientists, engineers, and artists in tow. It's not just a military expedition. It's a situation. Napoleon wants Egypt, but he also wants to study it. He wants to catalog birds, sketch obelisks, and possibly discover Atlantis under a sand dune. You dock in Alexandria, where the locals greet the French with a mixture of confusion and cannon fire. The initial landing is chaotic, but Napoleon's troops quickly capture the city. Then the march inland begins, across endless golden dunes, under a sun that feels like a personal attack. Soldiers ride camels with all the grace of wet laundry. Equipment sinks into sand. There are mirages, mosquito bites, and arguments about whether mummies are haunted. Napoleon, ever the optimist, responds by giving speeches about destiny and empire building. The troops mostly want water. Then comes the Battle of the Pyramids, which, despite the dramatic name, does not actually happen at the pyramids. Still, the image sticks. Napoleon arranges his forces in a square formation and absolutely dismantles the local Mamluk cavalry, whose flashy swords and fine horses are no match for disciplined French muskets. He declares victory and poses for a painting. He also says something like, "Soldiers, from the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." Historians still argue whether he actually said that or just really wanted it in the memoir later. Either way, it's a great line. But then, disaster. Back at sea, the British fleet, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, has been looking for Napoleon. And they find him. Or at least, they find his ships. At the Battle of the Nile, they blow the French fleet to splinters, trapping Napoleon and his army in Egypt with no easy way home. Napoleon reacts as any rational man would, by founding an institute. Yes, really. The Institut d'Egypte is established in Cairo. There are lectures on geometry, astronomy, hieroglyphs, and whether crocodiles have souls. Napoleon orders roads improved, mosques respected, and ancient ruins measured like IKEA furniture. He also has his men begin documenting everything: plants, animals, stars, street markets. This mountain of research will eventually be compiled into the multi-volume Description de l'Egypte, a tome so big you could use it to prop up a bookshelf or flatten a camel. Meanwhile, the actual military part of the campaign is less successful. French troops suffer from heat stroke, dysentery, and plague. There's a minor rebellion in Cairo. Napoleon quells it with cannon fire inside a mosque. Not a great PR move. He marches east towards Syria, hoping to expand the campaign, but gets bogged down at the siege of Acre. The walls don't fall. The supplies run out. The mood declines. By mid-1799, Napoleon decides he's had enough of sand, plague, and disappointment. Word reaches him that the political situation in France is unraveling. There's a power vacuum. And Napoleon hates vacuums, unless he's the one filling them. So, without telling most of his army, he boards a ship and sneaks back to France. The campaign is unfinished, the troops are stranded, but Napoleon spins it all as a triumph of science, civilization, and good intentions. He arrives in Paris to find a republic in chaos. People are tired. The government is weak. The public is hungry for stability, for glory, for someone who can do math and wear a uniform without tripping. And Napoleon, of course, is ready. His boots barely dusty, his mind buzzing with plans, and his ego practically humming with opportunity. The next move? A coup. Quietly, of course. With paperwork, maybe a few bayonets, and just enough democracy to keep things polite. Section 6. You step into a candlelit hallway filled with echoing boots, hurried whispers, and the unmistakable scent of a government about to be politely overthrown. The walls are lined with faded portraits of revolutionaries, most of whom are now either exiled, forgotten, or very headless. Somewhere down the corridor, a door slams. France is, once again, reinventing itself. And guess who's holding the pen? It's November 1799. Napoleon has just returned from Egypt, barely waited long enough to brush the sand out of his coat, and is now elbowing his way through the crumbling leftovers of the French Republic. The Directory, the five-man ruling body that was supposed to stabilize post-revolution France, has all the authority of a soggy baguette. The people are tired. Of coups, of chaos, of coins that lose value before breakfast. Napoleon senses it like a wolf smelling weak deer. The time for action is now. The plot begins, as many French plots do, with paperwork and dramatic size. 2 of the 5 directors agree to help Napoleon take power. The others are either pushed out, threatened, or distracted with ambiguous legal phrases. The pretext? A supposed threat from Jacobin extremists, which may or may not exist. It's very unclear, but also very useful. You find yourself in a carriage, bumping along towards St. Cloud, a suburban palace where the legislative bodies, yes, there are 2 of them, have been relocated for their safety. Napoleon arrives in full uniform, flanked by grenadiers. He's not technically allowed to be there, but he is. What follows is not a clean surgical coup. It's more of a dramatic group project gone sideways. The older legislators shout. Napoleon tries to reason with them. Someone faints. He storms out, then storms back in. His brother Lucien, president of the lower chamber, draws a sword and declares that anyone opposing Napoleon is clearly in league with the enemies of the Republic. Bold move. Questionable logic. Eventually, the soldiers, tired of this theatrical nonsense, clear the hall that what's left is a new constitution. It names 3 consuls, but only one really matters. Guess who? First consul, Napoleon Bonaparte. He now controls the military, domestic policy, and, frankly, the font sizes in official documents. Historians still argue whether the coup of 18 Brumaire, named after the revolutionary calendar, which we will politely ignore for now, was legal, brilliant, or just Napoleon doing what everyone secretly wanted someone to do. Either way, it worked. No guillotines. No civil war. Just a strong man in a shiny uniform promising order, and people like it. Newspapers print glowing editorials. Merchants reopen their shops. Even the army seems relieved. France, exhausted from a decade of revolution, welcomes the promise of efficiency over idealism. Napoleon gets to work immediately. He simplifies laws, reforms the tax system, reopens churches, but only a little. He even tries to normalize relations with the Pope, because nothing says modern governance like mutually awkward religious treaties. He also moves into the Tuileries Palace, formerly the home of kings. He redecorates it in a style best described as modest imperialism, with red velvet, gold trim, and exactly 1 million portraits of himself that 18 night. He stays up late reviewing battle plans, listening to reports, and occasionally scribbling in notebooks about education reform. The man cannot sit still. He is now not just a general, but a ruler, a legislator, a city planner, a legal theorist, and, somehow, a self-declared humble servant of the people. And through it all, Josephine drifts in and out of salons, entertaining guests, possibly continuing a few harmless flirtations, while Napoleon sighs dramatically in the next room, pretending not to be jealous that by the dawn of the 1800s, France has a new kind of leader. Not a king, not a president, something else. A general in a tailored sash who promises stability, but quietly dreams of destiny. And the crown? Oh, don't worry. He's thinking about it. He's definitely thinking about it. Section 7. You ease into a silk-lined armchair at the edge of a marble hallway, somewhere inside the freshly polished Tuileries Palace. A fire crackles on the hearth. Servants whisper like breezes. And from the next room comes the soft, unmistakable scratch of a quill racing across parchment. It's Napoleon. Again, writing something that will, within weeks, be legally binding and weirdly italicized. It's 1800, and Napoleon Bonaparte is now first consul of the French Republic, which is less of a job title and more of a polite way of saying guy in charge of literally everything. He's not emperor yet, but the office already smells faintly of crown polish. What does he do with this power? Well, for starters, he rewrites the entire legal system. Enter the Napoleonic Code, a vast reorganization of French civil law. It's all about property rights, contracts, family law, and how to do paperwork without crying. Gone are the feudal leftovers and contradictory statutes. In comes a crisp, orderly system with just enough vagueness to allow for future power grabs, that it's rational, efficient, and surprisingly enduring. So much so that parts of it are still used today in various countries. Napoleon, ever humble, refers to it as his greatest legacy, which is impressive, considering he's also conquered half of Europe by the time he says this. But Napoleon isn't content just running France. He redesigns it, he centralizes education, creates elite schools called lycées, revamps the tax system, establishes the Bank of France, and even sets national prices for bread. Spoiler, they fluctuate anyway. He restores relations with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801, a treaty so diplomatic that both sides pretend they're winning. Priests are allowed back, but Napoleon keeps control over appointments. Because of course he does that, he also spends an inordinate amount of time on design. Yes, design. Uniforms, flags, medals. If it's symbolic and shiny, Napoleon wants to be involved. He even orders all officials to start wearing Roman-style laurel wreaths for official portraits. It's giving toga cosplay, but with military precision. Historians still debate whether this was vanity or branding genius. Either way, it worked. French citizens start seeing Napoleon not just as a general or a politician, but as an idea, a symbol of order, glory, and well-tailored jackets. Meanwhile, Josephine is thriving. As first consul's wife, she hosts glittering receptions, redecorates salons with alarming speed, and tries not to panic when Napoleon starts asking about heirs. They have no children together, only her two from a previous marriage. And the question of succession, well, it's awkward, but Napoleon pushes forward in 1802. The people, tired of monarchy but even more tired of change, vote overwhelmingly to make him consul for life. It's a very democratic way of saying, sure, just run the place indefinitely. Napoleon accepts with the modest air of someone who had the banners pre-printed. He keeps working, keeps centralizing, keeps dreaming, and then, in 1804, he makes his boldest move yet. He decides it's time for a crown, not a metaphorical one. A real, glittering, gold-plated, velvet-lined, history book crown. The Senate declares him Emperor of the French. But of course, this is Napoleon we're talking about. He won't just be crowned. He needs a moment. So, on December 2nd, inside the majestic Notre Dame Cathedral, in the presence of Pope Pius VII, Napoleon does something wildly unorthodox. He takes the crown from the Pope's hands and places it on his own head. The message? Thanks, Your Holiness, but I've got this. It's theatrical. It's audacious. It's very on brand. And just like that, the revolution ends not with a whimper, but with a trumpet flourish and a man named Bonaparte becoming emperor in the very nation that once beheaded its king. The irony? Delicious. The ambition? Unstoppable. The next step? Europe. Lots and lots of Europe. Section 8. The scent of incense hangs thick in the vaulted air of Notre Dame Cathedral. Your boots echo softly on the black and white marble floor as you find a quiet place near the back, somewhere between a wide-eyed diplomat and a nervous archbishop. The pews are full, the candles are lit, and outside, a restless Paris watches with the barely contained excitement of a nation attending its most controversial costume party. It's December 2nd, 1804. Napoleon Bonaparte is about to become Emperor of the French. Not king, emperor. It's a subtle distinction, like the difference between ruler by divine right and ruler by military math and charisma. France has technically done away with monarchy, but this is something else. A reboot. A new empire for a new age. The Pope is here. That's right, Pius VII has traveled all the way from Rome, bless his papal patience, to preside over the coronation. It's meant to give the whole affair a sense of legitimacy, solemnity, and old-school spiritual flair. But of course, Napoleon has other plans. You watch as he strides up the steps of the altar, velvet robes swishing like theater curtains, gold embroidery sparkling with the kind of confidence that says, "I didn't come all this way to be passive." In a move that shocks the clergy, confuses the nobles, and absolutely delights the caricaturists, Napoleon grabs the crown himself. He does not kneel. He does not wait. He lifts the imperial diadem, heavy with centuries of symbolism, and places it firmly on his own head. It is the political equivalent of saying, "Thanks, but I'll do it myself." Josephine, for her part, kneels with graceful composure. Napoleon crowns her empress, too. She's radiant. He's beaming. The Pope tries not to look too awkward. The crowd bursts into restrained applause, which is the only kind allowed in cathedrals. And just like that, it's official. France has an emperor again. But not a Bourbon. Not a descendant of ancient kings. This one is self-made. A Corsican outsider who used cannonballs and charisma to climb all the way to the top, and then rewrote what top even means. The ceremony continues for hours. There's music, Latin, more incense, and a lot of very stiff hats. But what really matters isn't the ritual. It's the narrative. Napoleon has cemented his image not as a usurper, but as the rightful heir to Roman glory, Charlemagne's legacy, and his own unrelenting ambition. He commissions a painting of the event by Jacques-Louis David, the official artist of imperial propaganda. The portrait doesn't show the Pope crowning Napoleon. It shows Napoleon already crowned, mid-motion, mid-glory, mid-legend. David is told to make Josephine look 10 years younger and slightly taller. He complies. Meanwhile, back at the office, Napoleon begins signing everything Napoleon the First. The First. It has a nice ring to it. Historians still argue whether this coronation marked the end of the revolution or just another mutation. Was Napoleon betraying its ideals? Or fulfilling its promise, rising by merit, not bloodline? The answer, like most things involving Napoleon, depends on who's doing the talking and whether they're wearing a bicorn. What's certain is that from now on, things accelerate. Napoleon no longer fights for the Republic. He fights for empire, for a France that doesn't just survive Europe's wars, but dominates them. And for a legacy that reaches beyond statues and currency into the very blueprint of history itself. He expands the court, invents new titles, and introduces a fresh round of fashion guidelines that involve gold sashes, eagles, and enough epaulets to cover a parade float. And yet, despite all this ceremony, he remains a workaholic at heart. By candlelight, he still pores over maps, troop reports, and supply chains. He writes laws by day and battle plans by night. He drafts education reforms between reorganizing entire regions of Europe. He's not just an emperor in name. He's an administrator, a micromanager, a dreamer, a strategist, and above all, a man who truly, deeply believes he's doing what France needs. Or, at the very least, what France will thank him for later. And so, crown firmly planted, empire freshly declared, Napoleon turns back to his maps and murmurs something about Austria, because nothing says honeymoon phase like planning your next war. Section 9. You find yourself standing on a misty ridge at dawn, the frost crackling under your boots and the sky just starting to blush with morning light. Below, in the valley, thousands of soldiers adjust their packs and murmur in hushed French and Czech. The year is 1805. The location? A little village in the Austrian Empire. And the man who's about to rewrite the definition of decisive victory is currently sipping lukewarm coffee in a tent that's more organized than most government offices. This is Austerlitz, or as Napoleon will later call it, the finest of my battles. It starts, as many of his battles do, with a clever bait-and switch. The enemy alliance, Austria and Russia, outnumbers the French. But Napoleon feigns weakness, lets them think he's retreating, and draws them into attacking what appears to be a vulnerable flank. Spoiler, it's not vulnerable. It's bait. And once the Allies commit, Napoleon punches through their center, divides their forces, and unleashes a flanking maneuver that textbooks still write love letters about. The fog lifts. The sun breaks through. The son of Austerlitz becomes legend. Over 30,000 Allied troops are killed, wounded, or captured. The French suffer far fewer losses. And Europe realizes, with a sort of collective gulp, that Napoleon isn't just a lucky general, he's a tactical phenomenon. He returns to Paris in triumph, met with parades, speeches, and very enthusiastic hat-waving. His empire stretches across much of Western Europe now, and his influence extends even further into law, culture, and the increasingly ornate dinner menus of his court. But here's the thing, when you're climbing that fast, the view is glorious. But the pressure gets weird. First, there's the matter of Spain. In 1808, Napoleon makes the mistake of thinking Spain will be easy to control. He installs his brother Joseph as king, yes, just like that, expecting the locals to accept this like a free upgrade. They do not. Instead, a stubborn, guerrilla-style resistance erupts, peasants, priests, and partisans all rising up against the French presence. They know the terrain. They fight dirty. And they do not go away. It's a nightmare. French troops find themselves ambushed in mountain passes, poisoned in villages, and drained by a war that has no clear front or finish line. Napoleon sends in more troops. The more he sends, the more tangled it becomes. The Spanish call it the War of Independence. Napoleon calls it something he can't print in public. Historians still debate whether Spain was his first real strategic blunder. One thing's clear, it bleeds him, slowly but relentlessly, for years. Then there's the matter of family. Napoleon has an entire Bonaparte clan, and he treats them like chess pieces, placing them on thrones, marrying them into royalty, and occasionally replacing them when they prove less competent than a houseplant. His brother Louis, made King of Holland, keeps trying to govern like a Dutchman, not a Bonaparte. Napoleon gets annoyed. His sister Caroline keeps interfering in Naples. His brother Lucien disagrees with the whole empire thing and moves to Rome to write poetry and sulk. It turns out that even emperors can't micromanage siblings. And then, there's Josephine. She's still radiant, still stylish, still charming, but also still without an heir. Napoleon wants a dynasty, a line of succession, a little Bonaparte to carry on the empire. Josephine has given him love, elegance, and loyalty, well, eventually, but not a child. And so, beneath the glittering facade of imperial success, cracks begin to show. The empire grows. The victories continue. But the inner circle? Not so steady. And as Napoleon sets his eyes further east toward a vast, frosty land of tsars and snowdrifts, he can't shake the sense that his greatest challenges won't come from the battlefield alone. Because sometimes, the hardest wars aren't fought with bayonets. Sometimes, they come dressed as brothers, wives, and stubborn little kingdoms that refuse to be managed. Section 10. You're trudging through an endless field of snow, the wind howling like it holds a personal grudge. Your boots are stiff with frost, your breath escapes in little gasps of white fog, and somewhere ahead, a drumbeat stumbles on through the ice. Welcome to Russia. Please enjoy your complimentary chilblains and creeping sense of doom. It's 1812, and Napoleon, riding high on years of European domination, has decided that the next logical step is to invade the largest, coldest country on the continent. Why? Because the Russian Tsar, Alexander I, won't stop trading with Britain, despite Napoleon's embargo known as the Continental System. And if there's one thing Napoleon cannot stand, it's being ignored. So he assembles the Grande Army, a force so massive it feels like it needs its own postal code. Over 600,000 troops, drawn from every corner of his empire, French, Poles, Italians, Germans, even reluctant Spaniards. They crossed the Niemen River in June, expecting a swift campaign. But this is Russia. Nothing is ever swift, or dry, or warm. The Russians retreat. Strategically, slowly. They don't give Napoleon the satisfying, decisive battle he wants. Instead, they burn everything as they go, villages, crops, storage barns. It's called scorched earth, and it works disturbingly well. The French advance into a vacuum of ash, hunger, and extremely sarcastic ravens. Weeks stretch into months. The summer heat gives way to sleet. Supply lines begin to sag like wet spaghetti. Soldiers start eating horses. Horses start disappearing before dawn. Then, finally, in early September, Borodino. It's a brutal, grinding slugfest. Over 70,000 casualties in one day. No brilliant maneuvers, no flanking elegance, just cannon blasts, bayonet charges, and bodies piled like barricades. Napoleon wins, technically, but it's the kind of victory that smells like burning leather and regret. Still, the path to Moscow is open. He marches in, expecting a formal surrender, perhaps even a parade, but Moscow is empty. The locals have fled. The city is silent. And then, slowly, it burns. Fires erupt across neighborhoods. It's unclear whether Russian saboteurs lit them or if it was just the world's most aggressive housewarming. But the result is clear. Napoleon's prize is a smoking husk. He stays in Moscow for over a month, hoping Alexander will negotiate. He does not. No letter. No envoy. Just snow. Creeping into the streets like an indifferent assassin, Napoleon finally gives the order to retreat in October. It's already too late. The Russian winter falls like a guillotine. Temperatures plunge. Rivers freeze. Frostbite becomes a common accessory. The army, already weakened by disease, hunger, and desertion, begins to collapse. Uniforms stiffen. Cannons are abandoned. Wolves circle. Soldiers freeze upright mid-march to the Berezina River. The remnants of the army attempt to cross while under Russian fire. It's chaos. Bridges break. Men drown. Survivors stagger onward, hollow-eyed, barely speaking. By the time the Grande Army limps back into friendly territory, fewer than 100,000 remain. Of the original 600,000, the vast majority are dead, missing, or too ill to fight. Napoleon rides ahead of the survivors, silent, gaunt, and uncharacteristically grim. His cloak flaps in the wind like a tired banner. Historians still debate whether he underestimated the Russian resistance or simply overestimated the durability of his own machine. Probably both. It was his most ambitious campaign, and his most catastrophic. But even now, even with the cold still clinging to his boots, Napoleon refuses to collapse. He arrives in Paris before anyone even expects him. Having traveled incognito with a few guards and the stubbornness of a man who refuses to be remembered for frostbite, France greets him with mixed feelings. The myth is dented, the crown a little tarnished, but the man? Still very much in control. At least, for now. Because if Russia was a miscalculation, what comes next will make winter feel like a warm-up. Section 11. You're perched on a muddy ridge outside a gray little town in Saxony, staring across an ocean of bayonets, banners, and very unhappy alliances. The wind smells of rain and gunpowder. Somewhere in the distance, a Polish cavalryman sneezes. You pull your coat tighter, because this battle is going to be long, loud, and historically inconvenient. It's October 1813, and the world has finally had enough of Napoleon Bonaparte. Welcome to the Battle of Leipzig, also known, not so affectionately, as the Battle of the Nations. It is the largest battle in European history before the 20th century. Over 600,000 soldiers, from almost every corner of the continent, all gathered for one purpose: to make Napoleon go away. After the disastrous Russian campaign, the myth of Napoleon's invincibility begins to crack. Former allies peel away like unhappy stickers. Prussia, Austria, Russia, Sweden, even Bavaria, all joining forces to drive him out of Germany. And this time, they bring everything: muskets, sabers, field orchestras, generals with unpronounceable names, and the kind of coordinated rage normally reserved for family reunions with inheritance disputes. Napoleon fights brilliantly, as usual, but numbers and logistics betray him. The Allies overwhelm his forces, and after 3 days of brutal fighting, his troops are forced to retreat across a single bridge. And because the 19th century never misses a chance for drama, that bridge gets blown up too early, trapping thousands of his soldiers on the wrong side. Chaos ensues that he retreats to France, bleeding men and momentum. By early 1814, enemy troops are pushing into French territory. Paris itself is threatened, and for the first time, even Napoleon's own marshals begin to whisper, "Maybe we should talk terms?" Napoleon? He's not listening. That he launches a lightning campaign, one of his most impressive, tactically speaking, winning several battles in rapid succession. But it's not enough. The Allies have learned. They no longer chase glory, they chase results. And so, on March 31st, 1814, Paris falls. Not with a bang, but with white flags and polite negotiations. Napoleon's government tries to hold out. The Senate, that ever-flexible body of French politics, suddenly remembers it never liked him that much anyway. Faced with desertions, betrayals, and the steady tread of foreign boots in the capital, Napoleon finally accepts the inevitable. He abdicates. Not once, but twice, because the first attempt to install his son as successor goes about as well as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. And thus, the Emperor of the French becomes the sovereign of Elba. Yes, Elba, a small island off the coast of Italy, roughly the size of modern-day Bad Decisions. He's allowed to keep a tiny guard, a tiny palace, and a tiny navy, consisting of one ship and several enthusiastic rowboats. He even gets a new title, Emperor of Elba, which sounds like something invented by a child playing Risk. You arrive with him on the island. The beaches are quiet, the townspeople confused, the local goats unimpressed, and yet Napoleon works. He reorganizes Elba's economy, improves the roads, launches mining projects, and writes laws. He holds parades, reviews troops, orders uniforms, because he simply doesn't know how to stop ruling things. But here's the thing. He's watching. That he's reading French newspapers, sent in secret. He hears rumors that Louis XVIII, the restored Bourbon monarch, is already unpopular. That the people whisper Napoleon's name again. That old soldiers cry into their wine. And, as always, he waits. Not with despair, but calculation. Historians still debate whether his exile was ever meant to last. But you don't have to be a strategist to know. If you give Napoleon a little island, he'll find a way to make it into a launch pad. Because retirement, for some, means fishing and slippers. For Napoleon, it means a second act. Section 12. You're standing on a rocky beach in southern France, squinting toward the horizon as a peculiar little flotilla bobs its way toward shore. The lead vessel flies no official flag. There are no booming announcements or royal fanfares. Just a determined man in a gray greatcoat, boots dusty from exile, stepping calmly onto French soil like he's just popping out for groceries. It's March 1st, 1815. And Napoleon Bonaparte is back. After just 10 months on the island of Elba, rebuilding roads, reviewing imaginary armies, and probably reorganizing the local pigeon population, Napoleon has decided retirement is not for him. The French people are restless, the Bourbon monarchy is stumbling, and the world? Well, it seems distracted, so he escapes. Simply, quietly. His guards don't stop him. His ship sails unchallenged, and he lands near Golfy Juan with a few hundred loyal troops, a sack of uniforms, and the kind of confidence that makes history nervous. You march with him north, through snow-dusted fields and tiny towns. There's no grand army yet, just whispers, then cheers, then entire regiments, sent to arrest him. Joining him instead, at one point, outside Laffrey, royal troops block the road. Napoleon walks forward alone, opens his coat, and says, "If any of you would shoot your emperor, do it now." Nobody does. They cheer, they weep, they switch sides. And just like that, Napoleon begins the most absurd, improbable comeback in military history. The 100 Days. By March 20th, he enters Paris. The king flees. The people flood the streets. The tricolor flag flies again. It's as if the past year never happened. Napoleon retakes control without a single shot fired. The newspapers? Glorious. First, the Corsican monster has landed. Then, Bonaparte advances through the Alps. Then, Napoleon is in Lyon. Finally, His Majesty enters Paris. A complete narrative arc in under 3 weeks. But the rest of Europe is not amused. The Allies, Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, immediately declare him an outlaw. Not a head of state, just a disturber of the peace. They begin mobilizing. Fast, Napoleon, meanwhile, works like a man possessed. He revamps the army, calls up veterans, promises reforms, writes speeches, kisses babies, and tries desperately to build alliances. Some former officials return to his side. Many hesitate. The clock ticks. By June, he leads a fresh army north into Belgium. His goal? Strike first. Defeat the Allies before they fully unite. He meets the Prussians at Ligny and wins. Barely. But just 2 days later, he faces the British and their allies, led by the famously unflappable Duke of Wellington, near a sleepy village with a name that will echo across centuries. Waterloo. But that's another tale. For now, you stand on a French hillside as drums roll, sabers glint, and soldiers cheer their returned emperor like he's a legend carved from brass. For a moment, everything feels possible again. The eagles fly, the tricolor flutters, and Napoleon, astride his white horse, tips his hat to the crowd. He has gambled everything on this final campaign. Glory, redemption, legacy. And as always, he believes he can win. Section 13. You stand ankle-deep in a Flemish field that feels less like farmland and more like a particularly vengeful swamp. Rain has been falling since last night, soaking the earth, softening cannon wheels, and making every boot squelch like a soggy symphony. The sky above is gray, the birds have gone suspiciously quiet, and somewhere nearby, a man in a very famous hat is trying not to swear at the clouds. It's June 18th, 1815. Welcome to Waterloo. Napoleon has returned from exile, reignited French hopes, and built a fresh army with remarkable speed. His plan is classic: divide and conquer. Strike before the British and Prussians can fully unite. At first, it works. He defeats the Prussians at Ligny on June 16th, pushing them into retreat. But he fails to destroy them, and that's where the trouble begins. Now, on this damp Sunday morning, he faces the Duke of Wellington, who's positioned his Anglo-Allied army on a long ridge south of the village of Waterloo. It's a strong defensive position, flanked by farms, woods, and hedgerows, all ideal for repelling cavalry and confusing attackers. Napoleon wakes with a headache, a swollen ankle, and a growing suspicion that the weather hates him personally. He delays the attack until late morning, hoping the ground will dry so his artillery won't sink into the mud. It's a reasonable call. It's also a fatal one. You stand near the French lines as the first cannon volleys thunder through the morning fog. Drums roll. Infantry advances. The Battle of Waterloo begins, not as a masterstroke, but as a slugfest. The French launch a series of direct assaults. La Haye Sainte, a farmhouse at the center of the field, becomes a focal point of carnage. Musket smoke fills the air. Cannons bog down. Cavalry charges churn up mud and dreams alike. French cuirassiers, gleaming in armor, charge uphill, only to find Wellington's infantry hidden behind hedges, bristling with bayonets. Napoleon throws everything he has, but Wellington holds, and worse, the Prussians return. Remember that army Napoleon defeated 2 days earlier? They didn't vanish. They regrouped, marched hard, and now they're thundering in from the east under Field Marshal Blücher. Their arrival turns the tide. Napoleon tries to respond. He sends his Imperial Guard, the most elite unit in his army, veterans who've never broken. They march in perfect formation up the slope, and then they break. Hit from 2 sides, exhausted, demoralized, the French lines collapse. Panic spreads. Soldiers flee. The once grand army that cheered him from Paris now scatters through fields and forests. Napoleon watches it unravel with the grim silence of a man who knows exactly what this means. Historians still argue whether he could have won with drier ground. better coordination, or just a luckier wind. But the result remains the same. Waterloo ends the empire. He flees the battlefield, returning to Paris under the shadow of defeat. The government panics. The Allies advance again. His enemies smell blood. On June 22nd, just 4 days after the battle, Napoleon abdicates for the second time, this time permanently. He briefly considers escaping to America, but the British Navy has a different idea. He surrenders, and this time, there's no Elba, no gentle island retirement, no friendly European coast. Instead, the British send him to St. Helena, a windblown rock in the South Atlantic, 6,000 miles from everything, including mercy. As your boots crunch down on the beach one last time. You turn back toward that muddy ridge at Waterloo, where so many hopes were swallowed by rain and rifle smoke. The 100 days are over, the tricolor falls, and for Napoleon Bonaparte, history begins to close its pages, not with a bang, but with mud, delay, and one very punctual Prussian. Section 14. You step off a rocking longboat onto the narrow, volcanic shore of St. Helena, where the cliffs rise like frowns from the sea. The wind howls with a kind of personal sarcasm, and the only things that greet you are spray, moss, and one unimpressed goat. Behind you, the British sailors lower their hats with a mix of triumph and pity. They've delivered the most famous man in Europe to what is essentially a wet, distant comma on the world map. It's October 1815, and Napoleon Bonaparte has officially arrived at the last stop on his resume. St. Helena is not glamorous. It's not even mildly convenient. It's a remote British possession in the South Atlantic, 1,200 miles from the nearest continent, and approximately 6,000 miles from any remaining hope of escape. His new home is Longwood House, which sounds elegant but is in fact a damp, drafty, 2-story rectangle with mold in the walls and a leaky roof that Napoleon immediately hates. The ceilings are too low. The windows are too few. The wallpaper is a bad idea. He complains. Frequently. At length. In detail, Napoleon is accompanied by a small entourage, loyal officers, a valet, a doctor, and a handful of servants. All of whom quickly realize that living with an exiled emperor is not a tropical vacation but a slow descent into melancholic micromanagement. The British, determined to avoid a repeat of the Elba fiasco, take no chances. The governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, is strict, cold, and deeply paranoid. He assigns guards, monitors mail, restricts visitors, and forbids Napoleon from wandering more than a certain distance from the house. Their relationship quickly becomes one of mutual loathing. Napoleon calls Lowe a jailer and a bureaucratic insect. Lowe responds by filing reports so passive-aggressive they might qualify as poetry. But time, even here, passes. Napoleon settles into a strange routine. He wakes late, walks in circles around his small garden, and spends long hours dictating his memoirs to his inner circle. He recounts battles, decisions, conversations, always framing himself as the hero misunderstood. The soldier-scholar who modernized Europe, who crowned himself, who never quite got a fair trial from history. He writes, edits, rewrites. He argues over punctuation. He reimagines events with gentle revisions. The retreat from Moscow becomes an exercise in strategy. The Spanish nightmare a temporary setback. Waterloo. Well, Waterloo was mostly due to the MUD.AT night. He plays cards, drinks weak wine, and occasionally reenacts battles with whatever furniture and salt shakers are available. He misses his son, the little king of Rome, who is now in Vienna, far away and firmly in the custody of people who would rather forget Napoleon ever existed. And slowly, like the mist that rolls in each morning, his health begins to fail. Stomach pains, fatigue, swelling. The doctors argue, is it cancer? Poison? Stress? Historians still debate. What's clear is that by 1820, he is visibly deteriorating. The fire is still there on occasion, but mostly he's weary. He walks less, eats less, dictates only in fragments. In May of 1821, he takes to his bed and doesn't rise again. The sky that week is gray. The wind, as always, is loud. On May 5th, at 5:49 p.m., Napoleon Bonaparte dies. His last words, reportedly, are France, Armée, tête d'armée, Josephine, a final jumble of thoughts, his country, his army, his first love. His empire, reduced to syllables in a quiet room. The British bury him on the island, beneath a weeping willow, in a grave left unnamed, because they couldn't agree on what his title should be. Years later, his remains will be returned to Paris and reinterred under the Great Dome of Les Invalides, in a sarcophagus so large it requires you to bow just to look inside. But here, in St. Helena, the wind continues. The garden grows wild, and the house stands, weathered, crooked, and still faintly echoing with the sighs of a man who once ruled continents but couldn't escape the mold. Section 15. You're walking through a hushed museum in Paris, where the marble floors click faintly beneath your steps and glass display cases gleam under soft lights. Behind one pane sits a faded, oddly shaped bicorn hat, slightly worn, sweat-stained at the band, and unmistakably associated with a man whose very silhouette could launch a political movement or a musical number. This isn't just any hat. It's Napoleon's hat, and it's one of dozens, perhaps over 120, he wore throughout his life. Flat-brimmed, forward-facing, severe, and theatrical. It was more than headgear. It was branding. He wore them sideways while others wore theirs front to back. He wanted to be seen and remembered, which, of course, he is. Even in death, Napoleon refuses to be forgotten. After his passing on St. Helena in 1821, rumors swirl almost instantly. Was he poisoned? Did the British hasten his decline? Was his wallpaper laced with arsenic? Was he replaced with a body double? Yes, really. Someone tried that one too. Meanwhile, his belongings take on near religious status. His toothbrush, his death mask, his boots, his snuff box, even his hair, clipped and sent to admirers across Europe like relics from a saint of conquest. The British bury him quietly under that willow tree, but by 1840, French public pressure forces his remains to be returned home. His coffin arrives in Paris to a hero's welcome 18 years after he died. Crowds line the streets. Veterans weep openly. Cannons fire salutes. It's a second funeral, and this time, it's fit for an emperor. He's laid to rest beneath the magnificent dome of Les Invalides, where his sarcophagus now sits in solemn grandeur, pink granite, polished and massive, like a monument to ambition itself. But his legacy, well, it's complicated. Historians still debate whether Napoleon was a military genius, a benevolent dictator, a glorified tyrant, or simply a man with excellent timing and slightly too much energy. On one hand, he modernized France from laws to schools to administration. The Napoleonic Code still echoes through legal systems today. He reshaped maps, toppled monarchies, and temporarily made emperor seem like a job someone could actually apply for. On the other, he left Europe bloodied, millions dead, borders redrawn, empires destabilized. He censored press, controlled religion, and spent more time at war than at peace. For all his reforms, he rarely allowed dissent. And he did, after all, crown himself, and yet, we still talk about him. He appears in paintings, novels, cartoons. His campaigns are studied in military academies. His name graces street signs, ships, desserts, and even complex syndrome diagnoses. He is parodied, dramatized, admired, feared, mocked, and endlessly analyzed. Why? Perhaps because Napoleon wasn't just a man. He was a contradiction wearing boots, a revolutionary who crowned himself, a romantic who divorced for power, a conqueror who died isolated, a tactician who lost to mud. He makes us wonder about ambition, destiny, and the thin line between brilliance and hubris. And that hat, sitting quietly behind the glass, it reminds us that sometimes the smallest symbols carry the weight of the loudest legacies. So now, as the echoes of cannon fire fade and the golden trimmings of empire dissolve into twilight, you find yourself back in the quiet. The kind of quiet that lingers after a long journey. Boots unlaced, maps rolled up, and only the soft rustle of memory remaining. Napoleon has come and gone. His triumphs paraded, his failures whispered, his ambitions laid bare. What started as a lonely boy scribbling military fantasies in a Corsican dormitory became a story so vast, so intricately folded, that history itself still hasn't quite ironed it flat. You've marched across battlefields and through palaces, watched revolutions collapse and empires bloom in the span of a breath, listened to distant drums, the scuff of a boot on stone, the last sigh of a fallen sovereign. And now, perhaps, your breathing has slowed, the lights around you are dim. The air is still. The noise of the world, of history, of ambition, of endless movement, has softened to a low hum, like the wind across a lonely island garden. Let it fade. Let the myths fold gently into mist, the uniforms return to their closets, and the marble corridors of power echo no more. Sleep now, traveler. You've followed a life of motion, of thunder, of stubborn destiny, and here, at the end of it, is stillness. The story is done. Rest well. End of script. Sweet dreams.